Toji is the most legendary character in JJK, even more than Gojo, the character with his own arc who practically carries the story. I say this because if you say anything bad about Toji, you will piss off every JJK fan. And if you compare Toji to literally any other character, it's about as offensive as saying Luffy is a bad character. And for good reason. Fushiguro Toji is a character you meet and immediately recognize as one of the coolest characters in the story. Of course, there's something he does later that cements him as the legend that he is today, but we'll get into that towards the end of the video. Like I was saying, every pose and face he makes just leaks confidence. He has this mysterious air around him. He's a professional killer, not to mention he's the father of Megumi, arguably the fan-favorite character of JJK, even above Gojo. Plus, now with the anime adaptation, he's voiced by Takehito Koyasu, the voice of Dio and some of the most raw characters in anime. Everything about him immediately just gives you this feeling that Toji is built different. Of course, his hype was only elevated once we got to see him fight Gojo. Obviously, this next part is going to contain spoilers, so you might want to come back to this video later if you want to avoid them. Now, Toji sets himself apart from everyone in JJK as soon as the fight begins. For the entire arc, we see Gojo flex on people by saying they can never touch him. In every chapter prior to this, Gojo would flex on every villain he encountered, one-shotting people and messing with them just for the fun of it. And then Toji comes out of nowhere, breaks past Gojo's supposedly impossible barrier, and stabs the dude. And not like with a special anti-Gojo weapon, just a badass samurai sword. That is how he sets himself apart from every other villain that got memed on. But obviously it doesn't stop there. Everything Toji does after this is just so badass. Before the fight, we saw how smart he was when he explained that he was using bounty hunters to tire Gojo down. That way he could weaken his abilities, something that somehow nobody else thought of. Then we learn that, like Maki, Toji has a heavenly restriction, meaning that he is insanely strong. Strong enough that basically any of his attacks can kill Gojo. But it's not just the power of his attacks. As a weapons specialist, Toji fights with a wide array of tools, from weapons like guns that are common but reliable, to special cursed tools. It reinforces his skill and knowledge as a professional, but it also gives him his own style. This is how Toji chooses to fight, and you see it in the weapons he uses and the way he moves in the fight. All of this together makes Toji one of the most unique characters in JJK. But like I said, it also just makes him a badass. And people love badass characters, plain and simple. And it was this fight that defined Toji's hype. Now, just like whenever Gojo shows up, everyone freaks out when Toji is even mentioned, never mind when he actually makes an appearance. Like, he shows up in a fight later in the story, and it instantly goes from like an 8 to a 10 out of a 10 fight. But that's also kind of the problem with Toji. As much as people love him, it can be a bit too much. But before I explain what I mean, make sure to like the video if you're enjoying it so far. It's the easiest way to support the channel, and it helps spread the video to other viewers like you. Now, there's cool characters in JJK, and then there's the characters that are considered sacred. Toji is one of the latter. I'm sure there's plenty of other instances, but the moment I knew Toji was untouchable was when Maki was compared to Toji in canon, which, to be fair, is a very fair comparison. They're both members of the Zenin clan. They both have heavenly restrictions. They're both really strong. They both use a wide array of weapons. And they both left the Zenin clan out of spite. The only real difference being that while Maki is open about the fact that she's spiting the Zenin clan, Toji tries to be the cold killer that doesn't fight to prove anything. But despite all of their similarities, JJK fans were furious when Maki was first compared to Toji. It was like Oda had compared, I don't know, what's a really lame villain? It was like Oda said Hody Jones was like the Gold Roger of the Fishman world. People were pissed. Granted, some people like me thought it was a pretty fair comparison given the similarities, but there are still people that hate Maki purely because she was ever compared to Toji, a character unlike anyone else. And you know what? I totally see where people are coming from. And this is where I want to talk about the moment that cemented Toji's legendary status. Because when Maki is compared to Toji, it always has something to do with his power or how he fights. But like we talked about before, that's one reason why people like Toji. While Maki is a weapons specialist, she isn't nearly as experienced as Toji. Toji's raw power is made even worse by his ability to quickly analyze opponents and come up with game plans. It's his muscles and his brains that make him a threat. But even outside of fights, Toji occupies a role in JJK that no other character does. In JJK, there's an ongoing discourse about the conservative factions and the old families like the Zenin clan. A conversation about the older generation and how they place talent and potential above all else. In the new generation and how everyone should be nurtured and allowed to make their own decisions. Gojo is our first introduction to this, as he's the one that stands up for the students and is always opposing the older generation. Maki is our first look into the results of these narrow-minded views, as we find out that she's an outcast even though she comes from the most powerful clan. But even though Toji comes in after these two, he does something special. See, Maki and Gojo are still inside the system. They're the examples of fixing things from the inside. Toji, on the other hand, left that world. He's the example of someone who decided to do things entirely on his own, not only leaving the Zenin clan but going so far as to change his last name. Toji is the best example of spiting the establishment, as he's able to save his son, kill the star vessel with ease, and land 2 lethal blows on the strongest sorcerer. This reaches its peak when Gojo returns for a rematch. Prior to this, Toji was cold and calculated. He did everything according to plan, and let others do the fighting in order to protect himself. But this time, Toji makes a gamble. He fights Gojo on the off chance that he, someone with no cursed energy, manages to obtain complete victory over the pinnacle of the sorcerer world. If I were to make a comparison, I'd say that Toji is almost like the Stain of the JJK world. Whereas a character like Todoroki shows us what it's like to spite the system by its own rules, Stain is a character that shows us the injustice of that system by breaking those rules. That's really the big difference. Characters like Gojo and especially Maki are fighting against the establishment, but they're following the same rules. Granted, once the system breaks down, Maki does her own thing, but that's only when the system breaks down. Toji is untouchable in the sense that he is the only character that dared to challenge the establishment by going outside of the rules, breaking into the headquarters like it's nothing, and nearly defeating its best sorcerer. And even when he loses, we see the influence his actions have. If anything, Toji's death is a victory because he's able to influence Gojo. He convinces Gojo to look after Megumi. You could even argue he influences Gojo's opposition towards the establishment, as it's this fight that awakens Gojo's status as a mortal god. It's after this fight that Gojo begins to solo missions and sees that he can basically do whatever he wants, thus leading to his confidence when opposing the older generation. Even now, we can see Toji's influence in Gojo's fight against Sukuna, as Gojo's outfit strongly resembles Toji's. And that is why his fight with Gojo is so important. Toji is an instantly iconic character. He leaks confidence and he's clearly different from all of the other characters. So much so that you cannot compare him to anyone else without pissing off half the fanbase. But where that hype is justified is when Toji challenges the strongest character, almost wins, and influences the rest of the story after his death. That is the evolution of JJK's instant legend. But now I'd like to hear what you think. What do you like most about Toji? Do you think he's overrated? Share your thoughts and see what everyone else has to say down in the comments. I'll pick my favorite and share it as comment of the week on my community tab. And if you'd like another JJK discussion like this one, then check out my recent video on Gojo. In that video, I explain why everyone loves Gojo, even though Akutami seems to hate him. You can find it in the playlist linked right here. Until then, thank you for watching, and I hope to hear from you soon.